Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished law professor at Rutgers Law School and author of The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I also serve as the director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can learn more about the center by visiting our website at csrr.rutgers.edu or following us on Instagram at RutgersCSRR or on Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook at RUCSRR. The Race and Rights Podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, here as well as abroad. Today's podcast is entitled Settler Colonialism, Race, and the Law, which is the title of the book by our guest, Professor Natsu Saito. Professor Taylor explains why and how racialized disparities continue to persist in the United States and are unlikely to be effectively alleviated by the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of equal protection. She makes the case that structural racism will be more effectively dismantled by contesting the ongoing settler colonization of these lands and supporting the right of all peoples to self-determination. Let's hear what our guest has to say about this important topic.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Sahar, and thank you also to all of you who have taken the time to join us today. I'm really honored to be part of this series on race, security, and empire, and grateful for the work of this center, and also for the work that Professor Aziz and Joe Nagel and everyone else put into making this series possible. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, where I live and work on lands from which the Muskogee Creek Nation was violently removed, in a city that was made rich and powerful by enslaved as well as convict labor. Like almost any form of redress, land acknowledgements can be counterproductive. But for reasons that I hope will become clear, I believe it's really important to take the notion of being grounded quite literally, to pay attention to the history and spirits of the land that we're on, wherever we are. I've been asked to talk about my book, Settler Colonialism, Race, and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists. I'm not big on theory, but I think that the conceptual lens of settler colonialism can help us see the common structural drivers of the varied forms of racism and xenophobia that we encounter in the United States, understand why prioritizing indigenous sovereignty is essential to remediating structural racism, distinguish between redress that reinforces the status quo and that which empowers our communities, and envision liberatory alternatives to a system that has proven incapable of ensuring our freedom, equality, or basic human rights. We know that better worlds are possible, and to achieve them, we need to be clear about what's wrong and how it got to be this way. So we begin with where we are. It's scary to acknowledge the harsh realities of life on this planet today. We've triggered catastrophic environmental destruction. Climate change, devastated economies, political turmoil have generated millions of migrants, highlighting the arbitrary nature of state borders. The resurgence of white supremacy, accompanied by racist, xenophobic, and anti-Muslim violence, reminds us that this is anything but a post-racial world. And we see around us every day the effects of apparently intractable racial and gender disparities in wealth, income, healthcare, housing, and education, as well as incarceration rates and police killings. I'm pretty sure you've all seen the statistics. What's harder to grasp is that more than a half century after the civil rights movement, these disparities are not diminishing, and that the gains we've made have been accompanied by consistent resistance and retrenchment. It's increasingly clear that the Constitution's promises of equal protection and due process aren't going to materialize, but we seem to have a hard time envisioning alternate paths. The racial realism that Derek Bell insisted was the key to our survival tells us that if we're going to make meaningful change, we're going to have to let go of the very Western notion of inevitable progress and consider how, as Dorothy Roberts puts it, we rectify a system that so brilliantly serves its intended purpose. A good place to begin, I think, is with our narratives of origin, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, where we've come from, where we're going, what we fear, what we want, and how we should try to attain it. The dominant narrative, of course, highlights the earliest Anglo-American settlers, not as colonizers, but as righteously resisting British colonial rule in their quest for democratic governance and religious freedom. It sanitizes the violence employed against and the exploitation of indigenous peoples, persons of African descent, and later immigrants. Massive violations of fundamental human rights are relegated to a past for which no one is today responsible, dismissed as the inevitable growing pains of a state that would eventually come to represent the apex of Western civilization. But why did the, quote, founding fathers believe it necessary to kill as many indigenous people as possible and drive the rest off their lands? What motivated the enslavement of millions of Africans as well as American Indians? Why have Latinx and Asian peoples been encouraged to migrate and then summarily excluded or deported? Why the persistent denigration of Islam? And why are the dynamics that fueled these developments still alive and well? What functions do they continue to serve? These are the inquiries that led me to settler colonialism. I'm a third-generation Japanese American whose family was incarcerated during World War II solely because of their racialized identity. As I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, the liberatory potential of a new world order was palpable. Anti-colonial struggles and mass movements against military dictatorships were succeeding in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, inspiring student and youth uprisings throughout Europe and North America. It was a time of tremendous energy and hope. In researching this book, I thought a lot about that era. I remembered that many groups that inspired me saw racial oppression as a function of internal colonialism, and I wondered why, outside of indigenous communities, I rarely heard anyone talk in those terms anymore. Partly, no doubt, this was due to the social and political repression that decimated the more radical movements of the 60s and 70s. But I think it was also because many of us only understood colonialism in terms of European expansion into Africa and Asia. And while this was a useful analogy, American racial hierarchy only makes sense, I think, if we recognize the United States as a different kind of colonial power, a settler colonial state. Using that lens, much about our histories, both shared and diverse, fell into place for me. So let's turn for just a minute to what we mean by settler colonialism. Generally speaking, colonialism involves the exploitation of land, labor, and natural resources by people or entities, generally states, not indigenous to the territory, and the imposition of economic, political, and social institutions to facilitate that exploitation. Its ideology centers a civilizing mission, described by Anthony Angie as the grand project of redeeming the backward, aberrant, violent, oppressed, undeveloped people of the non-European world by incorporating them into the universal civilization of Europe. Colonial relations rely upon what Angie called a dynamic of difference, the, quote, process of creating a gap between two cultures, demarcating one as universal and civilized, and the other as particular and uncivilized, and seeking to bridge the gap by normalizing the aberrant society. The most obvious example of this dynamic is probably the construction of racial classifications intended to facilitate the colonial project. Despite the rhetoric of saving those deemed others, continued colonial rule is justified only to the extent that, quote, civilization is being promoted. And as a result, those who are colonized have to be kept perpetually inferior. Classic or external colonizers typically claimed lands, exploited labor and resources, sent the profits back to their mother country, and ultimately returned home themselves. By contrast, settler colonists came to stay. They rejected control by the metropolitan center and asserted direct rule over colonized lands and peoples. They presume, still, the prerogative to establish their state on someone else's land to create social, political, legal, and economic institutions for their own benefit, and to determine who may not, or must live within their claimed borders. This is why anthropologist Patrick Wolfe famously described settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. Because the colonizers came to stay, land was their first priority and remains a foundational principle. But the territory, of course, was occupied by people who, as Deborah Bird Rose put it, got in the way just by staying home. The early Anglo-American settlers couldn't envision systems of shared land tenure and governance, and were unwilling to adapt to extant indigenous polities. As a result, the forced disappearance of native peoples became essential to their mission. They justified this by racializing American Indians as lawless, warlike, wandering savages, even though the settlers' own documentation demonstrates that they knew better. And this laid the foundation for the invaders' claims that the lands they occupied were both vacant and legitimately obtained by conquest. You've heard, I'm sure, of the hundreds of massacres in which American Indians were indiscriminately killed, entire villages burned, crops destroyed, perhaps about the scalp bounties that were issued in every state and territory, or the sometimes deliberate introduction of infectious diseases. You may not know that at some points half the children forced into boarding schools never returned home, or that as recently as the 1970s, a massive involuntary sterilization campaign by the Indian Health Service cut the average number of children born to American Indian women in half. That really strikes home to me because that's my generation, my friends, and to think that our children's generation has half as many Native children as it otherwise would is really just kind of chilling to me. Direct elimination has been accompanied by strategies of conceptual disappearance, such as the arbitrary blood quantum requirements used by the federal government since the 1880s to shrink the federally recognized American Indian population, as well as its land base. This reinforces the notion that Indians have disappeared. It's also an attempt to erase indigeneity by collapsing innumerable polities and cultures into a single racial identity, transforming nations into minority groups, peoples that have the right not to be discriminated against, but whose sovereignty is not acknowledged. The experiences of other peoples of color within the American settler state have been quite different. Nonetheless, if we think in terms of the perceived needs of a settler colonial society, it becomes clear that the diverse ways in which we have been and continue to be racialized, exploited, and or forcibly excluded or included have common structural drivers, to borrow Tendai Achiume's term. As the settlers consolidated their control over indigenous land, their priority became making it profitable. And to this end, they began enslaving both American Indians and Africans. Examining the African slave trade and the institution of chattel slavery reveals the material and cultural losses systematically inflicted upon peoples subjected to both external and internal colonialism. It also exposes the extent to which enslaved labor provided the agricultural and industrial base for settler consolidation and expansion, an inquiry that's essential to meaningful redress. Enslaved labor was not just convenient, but it was essential to the settler colonial project. And again, racialization provided the justification. Thus, for example, the preamble to South Carolina's 1696 Slave Code explicitly noted that special laws were required because those being enslaved were of such, quote, barbarous, wild, and savage natures as to be wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of the colonizers. As Black evolved into a racial classification, it denoted white property and therefore was defined as expansively as possible, in contrast to the restrictive definitions of Indian imposed on those who might have land claims. After the Civil War, Black codes criminalized much of the Afro-descendant population for so-called crimes such as idleness, vagrancy, or disrespect of white people, and fueled a system of convict labor remarkably similar to chattel slavery. By the mid-1900s, we saw a shift from the initial drive to create an ever-expanding enslaved labor force to the perception of Black people as a surplus population to be contained and controlled. Thus, considering the settlers' perceived labor needs lends consistency and coherence to a history that moves from slavery to convict labor to our present carceral state. With respect to other people of color, we see variations on the themes of land, natural resources, and the desire for cheap, preferably disposable labor. Each community has its own narratives, and we don't have time to talk about them, but common themes run through our disparate history. I expect you're familiar with many of the ways that racialization has been used to legitimize the exploitation of land, labor, and natural resources, and to justify ever-expanding structures of social surveillance and control. As they have for more than 500 years, these practices are still framed in terms of promoting and protecting civilization as understood within the confines of a Euro-derivative worldview that orders all forms of life hierarchically and collapses the incredible diversity of human cultures and histories into a tightly constrained, linear path of progress and development. Viewed through this lens, policies and practices that seem aberrational, contradictory, or simply mean-spirited begin to make sense structurally as a function of the settler imperative for land, labor, and social control. But why do we care? Does a different perspective actually change anything? I'd like to share 4 ways I think it can help advance struggles for justice. These fall under the general headings of interest convergence, distinguishing colonization from exploitation, looking to remedies that empower, and dreaming big. First, a settler colonial framing illustrates that even as diverse communities experience racism in very different ways, the motivation to exploit and/or oppress comes from a common source. Discussing race as a function of colonialism meets with considerable resistance in non-Indigenous circles. Indigenous sovereignty is generally cabined in its own discursive sphere, while conversations about racism either ignore Native people altogether or at best include them as simply another minority. But if racialized power and privilege in the United States today are rooted in the historic and ongoing colonization of Native North America, dismantling the colonial relationships that still undergird the state is in the interest not only of Indigenous nations and peoples, but all subordinated peoples of color, and I expect a large majority of those who identify as white. And questioning the legitimacy of states and their claimed borders lets us advocate for migrant rights without reinforcing the myth that this is a nation of immigrants. Derek Bell argued that we only see progress toward racial justice where there is a perceived convergence of interest. When we employ a settler colonial analysis, we see the alignments that allow us to come together to contest ongoing colonization, not just as allies, but because it's our struggle too. My second and related point is that this framing takes us beyond discrimination or exploitation as the root of the problems we face. I addressed this in more detail in the CLE reading entitled Different Paths. There, I noted that the Black Power activist Stokely Carmichael insisted that if we want to dismantle structural racism in this society, we have to begin by acknowledging it as a settler colony. One of his key insights to me was that the exploited and the colonized move in different paths. Because both are oppressed, their material conditions may look similar. Colonized peoples, however, are not only economically subordinated, but he noted, quote, their culture, their values, their language, their entire way of life are stripped from them, and they're forced to identify with the oppressor. Economic exploitation can be remedied, at least theoretically, by redistributing resources and ensuring access to housing, healthcare, education, and jobs, by consciously eliminating racial and gender disparities or discriminatory practices based on nationality, religion, or immigrant status. I don't think any of this is likely to happen in a settler state. But even if it were possible, 2 fundamental problems would remain. The first is that a more equitable distribution of stolen goods is not justice. We just have more colonizers. And second, it wouldn't rectify what the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o describes as the most problematic aspect of cultural bomb that annihilates the people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. And this, I think, this undermining is what we have seen repeatedly with respect to communities of color throughout U.S. history. Because the remediation of exploitation leads only to more equitable distributions of wealth and power, it can be accommodated within the parameters of the Western colonial paradigm. And that's why I think we could emerge from the civil rights movements and the urban rebellions of the mid-20th century with expanded, minimally, but nonetheless expanded access to the privileges claimed by the settler class, but without either redress for historic injustices or fundamental institutional change. Which brings me to my third point. How we frame a problem leads us to very distinct remedial options. According to the dominant narrative, this is a democracy to be emulated by the rest of the world. Our Constitution and laws ensure fundamental rights and freedoms, and racism is being dismantled, if somewhat slowly, by continued enforcement of our rights to equal protection and due process. This narrative, however, cannot account for the patterns of exclusion, elimination, and subordination that persist, notwithstanding our Constitution and laws. And it ignores that large sectors of the population, notably migrants and those most directly colonized, do not have most of the constitutional, or many at any rate, of the constitutional protections, which others of us, at least theoretically, have. Also, this framing relies on an assimilationist, even if multicultural, it's still assimilationist framing that renders indigenous sovereignty invisible and makes racially subordinated people believe that their interests are aligned with those of the state. There's no room in this narrative to address the harm wrought by colonization. But we don't have to limit ourselves to domestic law as currently interpreted and enforced. We don't have time today to get into much about international law, a system that remains tightly controlled by those who wield state power, but nonetheless can help expand our thinking. International law offers much broader protections against discrimination than U.S. law does, based on race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin, and it acknowledges the unique status and rights of indigenous peoples. It recognizes as a foundational principle that all peoples have the right to self-determination, which is, to quote Rob Williams, the idea that human beings, individually and as groups, should be in control of their own destiny, and that systems of government should be devised accordingly and not imposed upon them by alien domination. International law also provides a much broader range of remedies, recognizing that the nature of the wrong dictates the appropriate remedy and that the perpetrator does not get to decide the form or extent of that remedy. If we free our minds to apply these principles, they have tremendous potential to help us assess what would constitute appropriate remedies for the foundational crimes attending the colonization of this continent. In this context, I often think of Robert Cover's reminder that when we believe that only the state creates law, we confuse the status of interpretation with the status of political domination. We ought to stop circumscribing the nomos, he says, and invite new worlds. Which brings me to my final point. Moving beyond the constraints of colonial narratives and relationships can free us to imagine new worlds and to understand ourselves differently. We tend to assess progress toward the equality we've been promised in terms of how class, race, religion, gender, sexual identity, and citizenship or immigration status affect our material well-being. But a settler colonial analysis tells us that these markers of identity have been constructed in order to ensure our subordination. Because our assigned identities are intended to keep us in our place, it's not surprising that they tend to be singular, atomized, and mutually exclusive, not fluid, overlapping, or reciprocal. It's pretty clear that race and gender as we know them are colonial constructs, and this means that relying on them to remediate disparities will ultimately prove futile, I think. Historically, most indigenous nations in North America have been matrilineal, with gendered roles functioning to promote harmony and balance rather than domination and subordination. By contrast, the civilized European state is unremittingly patriarchal. Women are defined as not men, described as less than, less intelligent, less courageous, less competent, less physically capable. Racialization, as we know it, is also a product of colonial rule on this continent and globally. And the issue is not just the particular characteristics that are ascribed to people, but the very notion of race. There's no logic to a system that limits whiteness to those of exclusively European ancestry, defines persons with one drop of African ancestry as Black, and refuses to recognize individuals indigenous to these lands as Indian simply because their ancestors' names were not inscribed on lists that were created by white government agents. No logic, that is, unless the purpose of racialization is to maintain the dynamic of difference that undergirds relations of power and privilege. The result is what Cheryl Harris calls a racial patriarchy, in which race and gender, as defined by the system, aren't just cultural attributes of European settler society, but essential to the maintenance of the colonial order. In this order, even property is a colonial construct. We tend to assess well-being in terms of disparities in the ownership of or access to property, but that presumes that property as we know it actually exists, and that ownership is defined by exclusive rights rather than collective responsibilities. Many of you are familiar, perhaps all too familiar, with the 1823 case of Johnson versus McIntosh, which relied on the doctrine of discovery to claim that American Indian nations could not, quote, dispose of the soil at their own will to whomsoever they pleased, and therefore they could not have really owned it. The bottom line for Chief Justice John Marshall was raw power. Conquest, he said, gives a title which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny. But he also noted that his holding might find some excuse, if not justification, in the character and habits of the people whose rights have been wrested from them. What character and habits? As one of his colleagues put it, American Indians were simply wandering hordes held together only by ties of blood and habit, and having neither laws or government beyond what is required in a savage state. This transparently false depiction is what allowed the settlers, presumptively white, male, Christian, and civilized, to claim an exclusive right to other people's land. But my point here is not that the colonizers excluded indigenous peoples from property ownership. It's that the land itself only became property, that which could be held, legitimately defended, and alienated upon its appropriation by white men. And of course, we also have the colonizers' racial construction of human beings, some human beings, as property. So we can't simply assume that property is a normatively neutral reference to material realities. And this means that we need to think beyond the redistribution of property rights. The last colonial construct I'd like to highlight is state sovereignty. Like property, the reality and legitimacy of state power is often taken for granted in our struggles for justice. It has come to seem natural for the planet to be divided up into states, each with virtually exclusive control over its lands and peoples. But there's nothing magical or inevitable or even particularly beneficial about state formations, and no reason to reflexively cede all power to assertions of state authority, particularly when it serves to construct difference and to legitimize the subordination of those deemed other. In the United States, we've seen people excluded from both birthright and naturalized citizenship based on race and national origin, and conversely included without consultation or consent. Consistently, citizenship and immigration status are used to exclude individuals and groups from rights and privileges and to force them to comply with state-imposed behavioral norms. Like racial patriarchy and property, this version of sovereignty has been created by and for colonial interest. If these are the building blocks of colonial rule, it's pretty clear that we won't be able to effect meaningful change in our economic and political institutions or the legal systems that protect them without deconstructing or disempowering these constructs. So to wrap up, Wolf's powerful observation that settler colonial invasion is a structure, not an event, tells us that the decolonizing of settler society will most likely not be an event, but a process or many processes of restructuring. These are processes we can facilitate by refusing to allow our imaginations to be constrained by colonial presumptions, by supporting the right of all peoples to self-determination, and by being willing to imagine societies unconstrained by assertions of state sovereignty. We can defend those attempting to decolonize their lands and communities, even when we might disagree with some of their positions or tactics. The devastation we see around us is not simply the collateral damage of an otherwise beneficial world order, the price worth paying for the marvels of progress. Rather, it's the direct and entirely foreseeable consequence of more than 5 centuries of colonial rule, with its imposition of social orders intent on turning everything encountered into property and assigning worth in terms of the accumulation and control of that property. Is it utopian to contemplate paths that might lead us toward legal, political, or economic formations unconstrained by state power and conceived outside the linear, universalizing hierarchical perspectives currently imposed on us? Probably. But I don't think it's any more utopian than believing we can meaningfully address racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, economic exploitation, or environmental catastrophe within the boundaries of the possible. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, Be well and see you next time.